So let's look to Psalms 32 here. It says, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, in whose spirit there is no deceit. Right there are all the elements of salvation, and Augustine knew that. He was a great theologian. He looks to it and sees transgression from the law of God, that God has set down absolutes that are not to be transgressed, but mankind does transgress those things.
Yes.
So this is his introduction to understanding sin, and it was in that moment. Now we're in a time where people, and particularly even in the Western church, we want to go forward as though sin is a foregone conclusion that has been dealt with. But God always brings you back to recognizing things about yourself because He wants you free.
Amen.
So what happens is there is forgiveness. He says forgiveness is possible. Forgiveness is possible. And that is the greatest blessing that anyone could have. And that's the greatest message that can be given to anyone in dark times.
Amen.
Forgiveness for your soul. Forgiveness to be right with God, to be reconciled with Him, is the greatest glory that could ever befall anyone.
Amen.
It's like the reverse of tragedy. It is a sudden cataclysmic event for good as opposed to evil. And so what happens, he relates that to it being covered. He knows that there's no forgiveness without the sin being covered. The other day I went to dinner with my brother and he tried to cover my bill. And eating the meal is interesting because it can give us an analogy of sin, and that sin is a type of pleasure that we enjoy in our fleshly carnality. But there's always a bill that goes along with it. Right. And normally we pay for things before we get them or as we get them. But most of the times when you go to a nice restaurant, you pay after you eat, after you've enjoyed the pleasure. Well, after that, my brother says, let me cover that for you. And I remember growing up all the time, I remember eating with family members and seeing like my uncles and my father all argue about, oh, I got it, I got it, no, I got it.
Yeah.
It was always frustrating for me. And now me and my brother are doing that too, now that I'm older. So what happens is my brother says, look, I'll cover the cost of the bill of the meal that you enjoy. Well, that's what Christ has done in His death on the cross. We won't go into that, whether you fully understand how it works. But you have a bill, a debt to pay according to the sin that you have committed. And some people say, well, it's not fair. I was born in iniquity is what the Scriptures say. I was born and shapen in iniquity. And so from the get-go, I never stood a chance. You always have stood a chance because Jesus Christ has died on the cross.
Amen.
And every day when you say, well, it's not fair. But every time that you sin, you reaffirm Adam's first choice to sin. You are reaffirming it, so you are not playing, and that excuse will not do before God. Excuses will not do before God. Stepping away from excuses, because it says there's a matter of imputation that says, it blesses the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity. It doesn't mean that there is no iniquity that has taken place. It means that something about this covering, the blood of Christ, such as when we have Abraham and Isaac, and there was a substitute. My brother wanted to substitute his payment upon my bill for that meal. Just as Abraham was able to substitute a lamb on behalf of his son, and then God later would provide his son on behalf of the bill that you have incurred. That is covering. And because of that, that guilt or that bill is handed over to Christ.
Amen.
It is not impugned to you. All of it's right there in Psalms 32. So I can see the mind of a great theologian looking at this and saying, that's what I'm going to cling to. Write that on my wall as I go to my supposed doom. That is what we all need to cling to. The testimony of Jesus Christ.
Amen.